Howdy, partners. Welcome to Saddle and Sixskin, your go-to channel for tales of the Old West, frontier lore, and the kind of stories that stick to your ribs like a hearty campfire stew. If you're a fella or gal with a few decades under your belt, especially if you're over 40, then you've come to the right place. We spin yarns here that harken back to a simpler time, a tougher time, when folks relied on grit, loyalty, and a good horse to get through. We appreciate you stopping by. Do us a favor and hit that like button, and if you're planning on being a regular, subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin, so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Now, let's settle in and spin a tale about a man named Nakai Whitehawk. Snow fell like a curtain across the high plains, each flake drifting slow as ash before the wind snatched it sideways into the dark. The land lay hushed beneath its burden, the wide world smothered in white silence, broken only by the dull rhythm of an axe striking wood. What kind of man finds himself alone in such a place? What drove him to seek solitude amid such harsh beauty? These are the questions that haunted the wind itself as it whispered through the pines. A towering figure worked bare-chested, despite the cold, muscles taut beneath skin marked by scars and years of battles that no one nearby remembered. His breath hung in clouds, his long white hair blown loose. Was he an omen to some? Perhaps. A legend to others? Likely. To himself, Nakai Whitehawk was only a man who had lived too long. What secrets did those scars hold? What ghosts haunted his sleepless nights? And why did he choose to face the biting winter without the warmth of a shirt on his back? Now, if you're enjoying this story, be sure to like and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. We've got plenty more tales where this one came from. Stories of courage, resilience, and the enduring spirit of the West. The cabin crouched against the storm behind him, built of logs cut square and stacked with care, smoke crawling thinly from its chimney. The axe bit deep again, splitting the log in two, the sound carrying sharp through the muffled night. He worked without hurry, each swing more ritual than necessity, as though the rhythm of his labor was the only clock he trusted. What drove him to such a solitary existence? What unspoken burdens did he carry within those calloused hands? The cabin itself seemed to offer protection and a cage, a shelter from the storm, and from his past. His body no longer obeyed time's calendar. 45 winters marked him, though his hair had gone pale in half that count. Children once called him Ghost Warrior. He called himself nothing. Nakai gathered the pieces, arms carved with the effort, and carried them inside. The warmth struck his skin, firelight kissing the walls in restless glow. Did he truly believe he was nothing? Or was that a shield he held against the world? What memories did those flames conjure as they danced on the log walls? He dropped the wood in its box and stood still a moment, listening to the crack of resin in the flames. The silence of the room pressed against him, vast as any battlefield. There were no voices to break it, no child's laughter, no woman's song, only the creak of timbers in the cold. He lowered himself to a stool and ran a hand over his hair, coarse and white as winter sage. What battles had he fought that left him so weary? And why did he choose to face the silence alone instead of seeking the warmth of human company? This story has only just begun, so let us know in the comments what you think happens next. Once he had been feared, then admired, and now merely old. He told himself he had chosen solitude. Was it truly a choice, or a sentence imposed by the world? It was cleaner than hearing the words townsfolk spat when his shadow fell across their doors, too old for her. Savage blood, white hair, white death. He let them say it because it was easier to carry their judgment than to bear false hope. Did he truly believe their cruel words, or did a flicker of defiance still burn within him? What drove him to accept their judgment when he knew his own heart? He fed the fire, set a pot to simmer, and sat back to watch the flames. Outside the storm thickened, the howl of it weaving through the cracks. A sound struck him then, faint but human, not the shifting of branches, not the groan of ice. It came again, fragile against the wind, a knock, or perhaps a collapse against his door. Was this a sign of things to come? Was the hand of fate pushing back against the world? Now, if you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, give this video a like and subscribe to Saddle and Sixskin. We appreciate your support. Knock rose at once, hand reaching instinctively for the knife strapped to his hip. He opened the door into a whirl of snow, the cold biting at his chest, and saw a figure half buried at his threshold. It was a young woman crumpled in the drift, her dress soaked, her bonnet torn. What was her story? What desperate circumstances led her to seek shelter in the midst of such a storm? And what would Nakai do? Her arms curled around a bundle, though the bundle proved to be only her own frail body folded against the cold. Her lips were blue, lashes clotted with frost, her auburn hair spilling wild. She looked scarcely 20. Nakai bent without thought and gathered her into his arms. Her weight startled him, not for heaviness, but for its lack. She was light as a child, yet she clung with surprising will, her fingers gripping his shoulder, even unconscious. What could this surprise hold for him? He carried her inside, shutting the storm behind him, and laid her near the fire. Her breathing was shallow, chest rising in shivers. He knelt beside her, brushing ice from her brow. His rough hands moved carefully, as though each gesture might break her. He stripped away her soaked shawl, set it aside, and pulled a heavy hide around her shoulders. Still she trembled. Why did he help her and not leave her in the storm? He stirred the fire higher, pushing fresh wood into its hunger, and the flames answered with heat that re-ened her cheeks. He studied her face as the color returned, delicate features drawn tight with exhaustion, a beauty not polished, but raw, like stone uncut. She looked out of place in his cabin, a bird fallen from the sky into the wolf's den. He should have left her to fate, perhaps. What will he do with the strange women? Her presence promised whispers, trouble, a rope of questions. Yet, as he touched her wrist, feeling the pulse flutter faintly there, he knew he could not. Hours passed while the storm pressed hard against the walls. How will this turn out and what will Nakai do? He checked her breathing, pressed warm broth to her lips when she stirred, held her upright until she swallowed. She slept, then woke briefly, her eyes pale as morning sky, unfocused yet searching. When at last her gaze caught his, something wordless passed between them. A question, a plea, a fragile recognition. Safe, he muttered in his own tongue, though he doubted she understood. What is he thinking about and what is he going to do? Her lips parted as though to answer, but only a sigh escaped, and she fell into sleep again. Nakai leaned back, watching her chest rise steadier now. The bundle of her presence filled the room, and with it came memory, his mother's songs, the warmth of children's laughter he had never fathered, the shape of a life denied. He felt the ache of it, sharper than the cold outside. Now this woman is here and has shown him that not everyone is bad. How will he help her and protect her? He had spent so many years building walls of silence, and with one knock they had cracked. The hours deepened into night. He sat by the fire, knife resting across his thigh, eyes on the door. Outside, the storm battered and screamed. But inside, a strange calm settled. He should have felt burden. What is his plan and how will she help him on his journey? Yet instead, a flicker of something else stirred, a reminder that the world could still surprise him. The woman breathed soft, curled against the hide, and in her frailty there was a strength he had not seen in years, the will to reach his cabin to survive. He rose at last, unable to sleep, and laid himself across the doorway, a sentinel against the storm and whatever might follow it. So, there you have it, friends. A taste of the Old West, brought to you by Saddle and Sixskin. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of grit, courage, and the human spirit. His knife gleamed faintly in the glow, his chest rising slow with the rhythm of old battles still alive in muscle and bone. He told himself it was duty alone that kept him watchful. Yet when she stirred in her sleep, murmuring a name he could not hear, his hands softened around the blade, and something warmer than duty moved in him. Toward dawn, the wind broke into lulls. The fire burned low, painting amber across her cheek. She opened her eyes once more, clear now, though weak. Her gaze settled on him where he sat like a sentinel, and her lips trembled into the faintest whisper. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice cracked, but sure. The words pierced him like no arrow ever had. Before he could answer, her eyes closed again, and sleep claimed her. Nakai sat unmoving, the echo of her gratitude still alive in the room. For the first time in years, silence did not feel like a cage, but like a promise. Yet, as the storm's howl returned outside, he knew this girl's arrival had shifted something larger than the snow drifts at his door. She had brought more than herself into his cabin. She had brought the world's judgment, its dangers, and a question he was not ready to face. And though he told himself he was too old for love, the fire's glow on her sleeping face whispered otherwise. Eliza May Carter woke to the crackle of fire and the weight of warmth she had not expected to feel again. The world was blurred at first, light flickering along log walls, the smell of wood smoke thick, the ache of her limbs sharp as broken glass. Her lips parted, pulling air deep into lungs that had nearly ceased. When her vision steadied, she saw him. The man sat in shadow, broad shoulders bare, a knife resting idly in his hand, as though it belonged there, even in sleep. His long white hair caught the firelight, gleaming like frost. She stared, half afraid, half certain she had stumbled into some other world. Yet the rhythm of his breath, slow and deliberate, proved him flesh. Her throat burned when she tried to speak. Only a rasp escaped. He stirred instantly, eyes opening sharp as blades. They were dark, steady, unreadable, yet she felt them pierce through her weakness. Without a word, he lifted a clay cup from beside him and held it to her lips. Warm broth touched her tongue, and she drank until her strength gave way. "Easy," he muttered, voice rough as gravel, though not unkind. He steadied the cup until she turned her head aside. She tried to thank him, but her voice failed, so she offered only her gaze. For a long moment, neither looked away. The silence pressed thick between them. She broke it with effort, words catching on her breath. "Where am I?" "Cabin," he said simply. The brevity struck her like a wall. She pushed herself upright, hiding her trembling hands in the folds of the hide that covered her. Memory crashed back. Jedediah Boone's grasping hand, the bitter threat in his voice, the choice between his house or the storm. She had chosen the storm, believing it would claim her faster and more mercifully. Yet here she was, alive in the shelter of a man she had never seen before. She studied him. He was older, far older than any man who might be expected to take her in. His chest bore the lines of battles past. His arms corded with the work of decades, not years. His hair, shock white, seemed both burden and crown. She felt a shiver that was not from the cold. "You saved me," she whispered, though it sounded like a question. He looked at her a long while before answering. "Storm found you. I carried you inside. Nothing more." Her eyes narrowed faintly. "That is not nothing." He shifted his gaze back to the fire as if her words unsettled him. His silence told her more than speech, that he was a man and used to thanks, perhaps even suspicious of it. She folded the hide closer around herself and leaned back, the warmth soaking into bones that had forgotten gentleness. When the trembling in her hands eased, she asked his name. "Nakai Whitehawk," he said. She repeated it softly, letting the syllables settle on her tongue. "Eliza May." He gave no nod of recognition, no welcome, only a glance that lingered before falling away. She wondered if he judged her as so many had. Too young, too plain, too desperate, but his face remained unreadable. The storm raged outside, its howl seeping through the cracks. The little cabin felt both sanctuary and prison, binding two strangers together in its narrow walls. She wished to fill the silence with words. Yet each attempt faltered under his presence. At last she asked softly, why do you live out here alone?" His eyes lifted, shadowed by fire light. For a long time, he said nothing. When he did, his voice was low, carrying the weight of years. "Because the world said I should." She frowned. "That is no reason." "It is enough." His gaze dropped to his hands, scarred and broad. "I am too old for the things that keep men among others. Too old for a woman's eyes, for children's laughter, too old for love." The word struck her more deeply than she expected, not because of their finality, but because she saw the truth. He believed in them. White hair, lined skin, solitude. He carried them as chains, yet called them armor. She studied him, and something rose in her chest. Pity, yes, but also recognition. "I do not think age is what kills love," she murmured. He looked at her then sharply as though she had spoken something forbidden. Their gazes locked. She felt her cheeks burn, but she did not look away. The moment stretched, taut with what neither could name. At last, he turned from her, busying himself with the pot over the fire. His silence was answer enough. Hours slid by. She drifted in and out of sleep, waking to find him always near, stoking the fire, repairing a broken strap, or simply sitting with his knife across his lap. Each time her eyes opened, she found herself studying him, mapping the lines of his face. The strength carved into his shoulders, the strange gentleness in how he moved despite his size. Once, when she stirred too quickly and winced, he was beside her at once, steadying her with a hand that engulfed hers. The warmth of his touch startled her more than the ache in her body. "You will mend," he said, and for the first time, his voice held certainty. She wanted to believe him. She wanted more than that, to ask him why he spoke of love as if it had passed him, why his eyes held so much sorrow when they looked at her. But exhaustion pulled her back into darkness. Near dawn, she woke again. The fire had burned low, and he was seated by the door, knife across his knees, as though he had never moved. She watched him quietly, unseen, and something tightened in her chest. He was keeping watch, not for himself, but for her. The realization swelled inside her until it felt too large to keep. Her lips parted, and the words escaped before she could stop them. A whisper carried on the hush between them. "I think I was meant to find you." His head lifted. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing as if unsure he had heard right. Eliza's strength failed her then, and her eyes closed once more. But the words hung in the room like smoke, impossible to ignore. Nakai sat rigid, the knife forgotten in his hand. The storm outside wailed, but the true storm had shifted inward, stirring something he had long buried. He had told himself love was behind him. Now a stranger, half frozen and half a child in years compared to him, had spoken words that shattered the lie. The fire popped, scattering sparks. He stared at her sleeping form, heart pounding with a weight he could not name. And in that silence, he knew nothing in his life would remain untouched. The snow eased at last, though its silence still pressed upon the land. When morning broke clear, the world glittered as if carved from glass, each drift glinting with cruel beauty. Eliza stood at the threshold of Nakai's cabin, the air sharp in her lungs, her shawl pulled tight. The storm had given her back to life, but it had also left her tethered to him, and she did not know if that was a gift or a danger. Nakai loaded wood onto a sled, his breath rising in heavy clouds. His movements were deliberate, his strength undeniable, yet there was something restrained in the way he handled each piece, as though aware she watched him. She had insisted on going with him to town. Supplies were low, and she could not bear the thought of hiding in the cabin while he bore the weight of all things alone. He had not argued, only fixed her with a long look before nodding once. The trail to town was quiet, save for the crunch of snow beneath their boots. She walked beside him, steps smaller, careful, her fingers clutching the edge of her shawl. He carried nothing of vanity, no coat, no hat, only a hide draped loosely across his shoulders. His skin bore the wind without flinch, his white hair catching the light like a banner. People would stare. She knew. They always did. And stare they did. When they entered the main street, all noise seemed to falter. Merchants paused in their sweeping, women lowered baskets slowly, children pointed before being hushed. Nakai's presence had always commanded whispers, but now Eliza at his side made those whispers rise into sharp edges. Willow Ruth Boone stood outside the mercantile, her shawl rich with fur, her mouth tight. She was Jedediah's sister, keeper of the town's gossip and its judgment. Her eyes slid over Eliza with disdain before landing on Nakai. "So this is how it is," she said loud enough for all to hear. "A girl near half a child and a savage old enough to be her father. Shameful." Eliza felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her chin high. Nakai did not break stride, his expression carved from stone. Still, each word lodged in Eliza's chest like a thorn. They entered the mercantile together, the hush of the room heavy as snowfall. Inside, Nakai gathered flour, salt, dried beans, his movements efficient. Eliza stood near the counter, clutching her hands together to still their trembling. Behind her, whispers broke like waves. "She's ruined herself. He's bewitched her. White hair, old bones. What can he give her?" The words pressed against her back until she could scarcely breathe. She wanted to shout, to silence them, but her voice stayed trapped. She looked at Nakai instead. He paid no mind, his broad frame bent over the ledger, his coin set steady on the wood. He moved as though their judgment had no teeth, yet she saw the faint tension in his jaw, the way his eyes refused to lift. Then came the voice she dreaded most. Jedediah Boone entered, his boots heavy on the floorboards, his presence filling the room. Tall, broad, his beard trim and sharp, he wore wealth like a weapon. His gaze landed on Eliza, and his lips curved in a sneer. "You ran from me into the storm," he said, his tone thick with mockery, "and found yourself under the roof of this ghost? Tell me, was freezing to death quicker or kinder?" The room stirred with uneasy laughter, cruel but subdued. Eliza's pulse thundered. She opened her mouth, but Nakai spoke first. "She owes you nothing," he said, his voice deep, steady, carrying across the room with quiet power. Jedediah turned, eyes narrowing. "And what are you to her?" "A relic with white hair and empty hands." "She's 20, you're closer to the grave than the cradle." Eliza could not stay silent. Her voice rang out, sharper than she had known it could. "I would rather share his silence than your house. I choose dignity over chains." The room fell still. Jedediah's face hardened, his pride struck. He stepped toward her, but Nakai moved, placing himself between them, vast and immovable. For a moment, the air trembled with the promise of violence. But Jedediah only spat at the floor, muttered a curse, and stalked out, his boots pounding like thunder. The whispers swelled again, some shocked, some pitying, many cruel. Eliza trembled, though she held herself upright. When Nakai finished his purchase, he turned and offered her his arm. She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand there, though the contact drew fresh murmurs. Together, they walked out into the sunlight, leaving the judgment behind but carrying its weight upon their shoulders. The journey back was silent. Eliza's words replayed in her mind, her defiance, her choice spoken aloud. Fear mingled with something else, a fierce pride that she had spoken her truth. Yet beside her, Nakai walked with the same unreadable face, his silence unbroken. She wondered if he resented her defiance, if she had bound him to something he had not asked for. Back in the cabin, the hush felt heavier than before. Eliza set down the supplies with trembling hands. Nakai stood by the fire, feeding wood to the flames, his face lit in restless glow. She could not bear the silence. "I meant what I said," she whispered. His shoulders tightened. Slowly, he turned, eyes dark. "You do not know what you said." "Yes, I do. She stepped closer, her voice trembling but firm. All my life, I have waited for a man who would not hurt me, who would not treat me as property. I think that man is you. He drew a breath, harsh in his chest as though her words struck where armor once lay. He shook his head, white hair falling across his brow. You are young. I am old, too broken. I cannot give you a life. Her throat ached, but she did not turn away. Slowly, she reached out, resting her hand against his arm, the gesture soft as falling snow. Then let me give you mine. The silence deepened, the fire snapping in protest. Nakai stood rigid, every muscle taut as though torn between pulling away and pulling her close. His eyes closed, his breath shuddered, and for the first time, the mask of stone cracked. But before he could speak, the wind rose outside, rattling the shutters, carrying the first howl of another storm. The sound threaded through the room like an omen. Eliza lifted her head, eyes wide. Nakai turned toward the door, his hand tightening around the knife at his belt. The world beyond their walls was not finished with them. The storm passed as suddenly as it had come, leaving the world wrapped in silence once more. The sky shone a brittle blue, the snow bright enough to burn the eyes. Eliza stood in the doorway of Nakai's cabin, watching the breath of her companion curl into the morning air as Nakai split wood. Each strike steady, precise. There was something ritualistic in the way he worked, as though every swing held back the voices of the town, the memory of Jedediah's sneer, and the burden of her whispered promise. She had not taken back her words. She would not. Yet each day since, Nakai had held himself at a careful distance. He showed her kindness, yes, set food before her, taught her how to patch hides, offered her his heavy cloak when the cold cut deep, but all without meeting her eyes too long, as though afraid of what lingered in them. The days shaped themselves into rhythm. At dawn, they gathered water. At midday, they worked side by side, and in the evening she mended torn seams while he carved figures from wood. Once, without explanation, he pressed into her hand a raven small enough to rest in her palm, its wings spread as if in flight. The carving was rough yet alive, each line full of patience. She kept it near her bed, turning it over in her fingers until sleep claimed her. It was the first gift she had been given without strings. In small ways, the cabin softened around them. She sang while she worked, quiet hymns remembered from childhood, and though Nakai said nothing, she saw the way his shoulders eased when her voice filled the room. He taught her words in his tongue, laughing once, startled, when she mispronounced and turned son into goat. The sound of his laughter lingered with her long after silence returned, a fragile treasure. But the world beyond their walls had not gone silent. When she ventured into town again, she felt the stairs heavier than before. Willow Ruth's voice cut sharp in the street. "Ruined girl," she spat, shacking up with a ghost. Others whispered behind their hands. Eliza held her head high, though each word scraped raw inside her. It was not only her reputation they slandered. It was Nakai's dignity, too, dragged like a carcass through the dirt. One evening, as they returned with sacks of flour slung over the sled, she found her voice trembling with anger. "Why do you let them speak so?" Nakai walked on, his gaze fixed on the trail, his steps measured. "Words are wind. They pass." "They do not pass," she whispered fiercely. "They cling. They poison. They make me feel I have done something wrong when all I have done is survive." At that, he turned to her, his eyes dark as storm clouds. "And what would you have me do? Cut them down until the snow runs red? I have lived long enough to know blood does not silence tongues. It feeds them." She faltered under his gaze, but she did not retreat. "Then let me speak. Let me show them I am not ashamed." His jaw tightened. "They will not hear." "Then let them see," she said, voice breaking. For a moment, he looked at her as though she were something fragile he could not hold, yet could not set down. He said nothing more, only turned and pulled the sled forward, his shoulders hunched against a wind that was not there. That night she could not sleep. She lay staring at the rafters, the raven figurine clutched in her palm while the firelight painted shifting shapes on the walls. Nakai sat at the table, knife flashing in the glow as he carved. She watched him, her chest aching with all the words she dared not speak. Finally, she whispered, "Do you believe I am ruined?" The knife stopped mid-cut, his head lifted slowly, his eyes catching the fire. "No." "Then why do you treat me as though I am breakable?" His silence stretched until she thought he would not answer. Then his voice came low, weighted with sorrow. "Because I am the one broken. My years are more than yours, my hair is white while yours is full of fire, I have carried too much loss to put it in your hands." Her throat tightened, but she rose from her bed and crossed to him, her bare feet whispering on the floorboards. She laid the raven on the table between them. "You gave me this. It is not broken. Neither are you." For a moment, she thought he might take her hand, his fingers twitched, his breath shuddered. But he pulled back, standing so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. He moved to the door, opening it to the cold night. "Rest," he said, though his voice was ragged. "The storm may come again." The door shut behind him, and she was left alone with the fire's fading light. Days passed. Their work continued, the bond between them both steady and strained. She saw how he shielded her from the harshest labor, though she insisted on carrying her share. She saw the way his gaze lingered when he thought she did not notice, the conflict etched deep in his face. And she saw, too, the shadow of fear. Fear not of her, but of himself, of what her presence demanded. One evening, as the sky bruised with the coming snow, Jedediah Boone rode to the cabin with 2 men at his side. Eliza was gathering water when she heard the hooves, and her heart seized. Nakai stepped from the cabin, shirtless as ever, his white hair wild in the wind, his sighs filling the space between her and the riders. Jedediah sneered from horseback. "You think to keep what's mine, old man? She belongs in my house, not rotting in a shack with a savage who's nearer death than life." Eliza's knees weakened, but she forced herself to stand tall, clutching the bucket to her chest. "I will never be yours," she said, her voice carrying though her body shook. Jedediah's face darkened. "You'll come one way or another." Nakai's hand rested on the knife at his hip. The tension was thick enough to choke, the horses shifting restlessly, the men's rifles glinting. Then Jedediah spat into the snow and jerked his reins. Another time, he growled and turned away, his men following. Only when the sound of hooves faded did Eliza's knees give out. Nakai caught her, his arms steady as iron around her waist. She pressed her forehead against his chest, breath breaking. He held her longer than he should have, then let go, stepping back as though burned. That night, the wind rose once more, keening through the eaves. The fire hissed and cracked. Eliza sat by the hearth, staring into the flames, her heart raw with fear and something sharper. Nakai sat across from her, his face shadowed, his eyes restless. She wanted to bridge the space between them, to lay her truth bare once more. Instead, she whispered, almost to herself, "If he comes again, will you fight?" The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Nakai's gaze met hers across the flickering light, and in his eyes was no answer, only the storm of a man torn between a love he denied, and a war he could not escape. The storm came without warning. A wall of white that devoured sky and earth in a single sweep. By the time the first shutters rattled, the cabin was already half buried, snow swirling in furious waves that clawed at the timbers. Eliza pressed her back against the door as Nakai forced it shut, the wind howling like a beast denied its prey. Inside, the fire flared, then struggled, sparks leaping and dying in the draft. Their breath fogged the air, the cold sinking its teeth through every seam. They worked quickly without words, Nakai feeding wood into the hearth, Eliza piling blankets around the window frame where the wind found its way through. Outside, the roar of the storm was relentless, the sky a weight pressing down. She glanced at him as he moved, his bare chest glistening with sweat despite the cold, his white hair wild in the firelight. He looked like some ancient figure carved from stone, refusing to yield. Yet she saw the strain in him, too, the lines around his eyes, the tremor that stole into his shoulders when he thought she wasn't watching. The night stretched long, measured by the hiss of snow against the roof, and the restless snap of flames. Eliza sat close to the fire, hugging the raven figurine to her chest, her eyes heavy with fatigue. Nakai sat opposite, his knife across his knees, watching the door as though expecting the storm itself to burst inside. She studied him, her heart thudding with all the words she had carried in silence, and finally, she spoke. "I do not fear the storm," she whispered, her voice thin against the wind's fury, "I fear what waits when it clears." His eyes shifted to her, shadowed, unreadable. "You mean him?" "Yes." Her fingers tightened on the carving. "Jedediah will come again. He will not let me go. And the town," her voice broke. "They would rather see me in his house than here with you." Nakai's gaze fell to the flames. His silence was heavier than any words. She leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Tell me, if he comes again, will you let him take me?" The knife in his lap gleamed as his grip tightened. He lifted his eyes, and in them burned a storm fiercer than the one outside. "No," he said, the word low and final. Relief shook her, but fear remained. "Then why do you keep me at a distance? Why do you tell me you are too old, too broken, when I see only strength in you?" He rose abruptly, pacing the small cabin, the fire light painting him in restless strokes. "Because it is truth. Look at me, Eliza. White hair, scars, years behind me. What life could I give you but solitude? What future but grief? I would not chain you to my fading years." She stood too, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. "You think love is measured in years, that youth alone makes it real. I have known only chains until now. With you, I have known freedom." His breath caught, his chest rising with the force of it. For a moment, he seemed to reach for her, his hand half lifted. But then the wind struck the cabin with a force that shook the walls. From outside came another sound, sharper, human, the crunch of boots in snow, the muffled voices of men. Eliza's heart lurched. Nakai strode to the window, peering through the frost. His shoulders stiffened. "He has come." The door shuddered with a heavy blow. Jedediah's voice thundered above the storm. "Give her up, Whitehawk. She's mine, and no storm nor savage can keep her from me." Eliza pressed her hands to her mouth, terror searing her. Nakai pulled the knife free, his frame filling the space between her and the door. For an instant, time slowed, the fire casting wild shadows, her pulse hammering, his breath steady as steel. The door shook again, splinters flying. Then Nakai flung it open and stepped out into the storm. Snow swallowed him at once, his white hair vanishing into the fury, but she followed him to the threshold, clutching the frame. The night was chaos. Jedediah and two men stood with rifles, their coats pulled tight, their faces cruel in the lamplight they carried. Against them stood Nakai, bare-chested, snow whipping around him, a figure cut from winter itself. Jedediah sneered through the storm. "Step aside, old man. She belongs to me." Nakai's voice carried like thunder, deep and unshaken. "She belongs to no man. She chooses her path." "She chooses nothing," Jedediah spat. "She is mine by right." Eliza's fear broke into fire. She stumbled into the snow, the wind slashing her face, and stood beside Nakai. Her voice rose raw but clear. "I would rather die here than live in your house. My life is with him." The words tore from her like a blade drawn, and once spoken, they could not be recalled, the men muttered, uncertain. Jedediah's face twisted with rage. With him? He's half dead already. He'll be gone before another winter and you'll be left a widow. Nakai's jaw tightened, his eyes locked on hers. And in that moment, something in him shattered and reformed. He turned, the storm lashing his hair across his face, and took her hand openly, lifting it for all to see. His voice rang above the gale. She is mine, and I am hers. Not by chains, but by choice. The words hung in the storm like fire, undeniable. The men shifted uneasily, rifles lowering. Jedediah cursed, but the tide had turned. The storm itself seemed to roar in answer, the snow thickening, the wind cutting so fierce that the horses reared, and the men struggled to hold them. Jedediah spat one last vow of vengeance, then yanked his reins and vanished into the blizzard, his men stumbling after. Silence fell, broken only by the wind's hollow wail. Nakai still held her hand, their fingers locked, heat against the storm's bite. Eliza's chest heaved, tears freezing on her cheeks, but her gaze did not waver. She had spoken, and he had answered. He turned to her slowly, his face raw, stripped of every mask. I thought I was too old, he said, voice breaking. She stepped closer, her forehead against his chest, her words a whisper carried into the storm. I have waited my whole life for you. He closed his eyes, his arms folding around her, pulling her into the warmth of his strength. For the first time, he did not hold back. The storm howled, the snow swirled, but within their embrace burned a fire that no wind could snuff. When at last they stepped back inside, the cabin glowed with a light that felt new. The fire crackled high, the raven